난 디시요게 응조 지시 거시 다 지시에 대 도선도 비리바세 지시 오르 디네시 내가 개발 가려서는 땡큐바이나 네 지시티게 밀루어리 바티게 참아라샤 버레스 인지 미지 참아들라 서도 밀루 서도 가지고 말레스 난 참아레스 하지 나 뭐라기보다 디솔야 참아들이야 네 지금 서도 가지고 버레스 나 지시티게 기진이 바티게 나는 참아마레스 지시레스 나 지시에들레 리글마선 이제 나가 저기 온수미 지수 잡히기 다 똑같이시에다 안에 지게 똑같이시들과 온수미 잡히 똑같이시 직제 제바가 지수 잡히 똑같이시세 똑같이시들래 이름이 다 온수미 지시들라 다 원보나 원비 온수미 이기 온수 라디오 나중 온수미 기진이 번이버디 차사 지시 차로로 온도스네 요레세 캐바도스네 아디슈시 마체
This morning we were looking at, started to look at, or we looked at subsequent cognition, and the definition or the essence or entity of subsequent cognition is a knower that realizes what has already been realized. And then we also spoke again about the definition of valid cognition, because of its relevance here. So a valid cognizer, according to the Prasangika, it doesn't need to be new. It's an incontrovertible knower. That is the definition of a valid cognizer for Prasangika, whereas for the other tenets, in particular, or the Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Svatrantika tenets, they have the three aspects of a new incontrovertible knower. And then we continued to have a look at the divisions, and we saw that subsequent cognizers are divided really into two: the directly perceiving subsequent cognizers and conceptual subsequent cognizers. And these have their own subdivisions. For example, the directly perceiving subsequent cognizers have the four, which relate to what we looked at previously in terms of direct perceivers and those four subdivisions. And then just now from my side, I just want to come back to Tanya's question, just hopefully to add some more clarity to the definition of a valid cognizer and a non-valid cognizer. So in Tibetan, they are identical except for the inclusion of a negation in a non-valid cognizer. So words such as no or not. Otherwise, they are identical. But in English, they're not identical. They're slightly different. And so, thank you for your question, because I think for me now I've got some clarity. Whether anyone else gets clarity, I don't know. But I think why we have it differently is in the two different translations, the two translations differing for valid and non-valid, is because there's a particle in Tibetan attached to the word for new, which can be interpreted in maybe a dozen different ways, a ladun. So this sarpa is new, this is the word for new. And here in the definition we have sardu, so this du is a ladun and can be translated in a dozen ways. How we have it translated in the second definition for non-valid cognizer is a more common way, which is to make a noun into an adjective, so newly. So that's quite a common way to translate it. And I think now that I look at it more, I think this actually makes a lot more sense, because it joins these two characteristics of this consciousness together. And in other words, makes it explicit that this consciousness requires or doesn't both of these, yeah? In the first definition, that of a valid cognizer, the same particle is translated in a less common way, but still correct in a less common way, as and. And hence we have two nouns and in between. So this is why I think there is the difference between the two. My personal opinion, ideally these two translations should be the same, whichever way one goes, just with including a negation. So, which would make the first translation, that for a valid cognizer, being a knower that is newly controvertible, and then we'd have what we have here for the second, a knower that is not newly incontrovertible. incontrovertible, yeah? So that would be ideal if we took the second definition and put it as the first for valid cognizer and just took out the word new, because then it would match the Tibetan very clearly. The reason I assume that for the first definition, that of valid cognizer, it was translated as new and incontrovertible, is because of how this is explained, which is immediately under the definition, we see the 3 bullet points. And here the teachers will always present the 3 characteristics of this definition. It's a knower, it's new, and it's incontrovertible. So therefore, 3 nouns make sense. So therefore, maybe the way it's translated the first time, for valid cognition, that makes sense. And then you should keep that for the second one, but then you need to add a few more things in, which is what I did in my version. A knower that is not both new and incontrovertible. So to my mind anyway, the meaning comes down to the same thing. But the key point we need to be clear on is that a valid cognizer, according to the definition of the school that this is written to, has these 3 aspects of it's a knower, it's new, and it's incontrovertible. So that's the key thing. And if these are missing, it's going to be a non-valid cognizer. So hence it needs to be both new and incontrovertible to be a valid cognizer. And if either of those are missing, it's a non-valid cognizer. So hopefully a little bit clear for those who are interested. But thank you. This helps my understanding anyway. I hope it helped some others too. Now returning to the text, amongst the 7-fold division of Lorig, we've looked at now 3 of the 7. Direct perception, inferential valid cognition, subsequent cognition, and now we come to the 4th, that of correct assumption on page 12, and this will later be followed by non-ascertaining awarenesses, doubt, and wrong consciousnesses, the full 7-fold division.
Rayula Shenbe Louis Shindik Duntus, Rayul Shenbe, Rayula Shenbe Louis Shindik Duntus, and then it gets a little says.
The definition of a correct assumption at the top of page 12, a factually concordant determinative knower that is incontrovertible with regard to determining its object.
Rayula Louis Rayula Shenbe Louis Shindik Duntus, Rayu Shenba, so the Rayu Dunjidan Jew, Nang, Dunjidan Jew, Nangje, you did the Zimba, Rayu Shenba, Rayu did not do, Sosola, you did not do, Dunjidan Jew, Nangje, and you did Zimba de la, and the Rayu Shenbes, Shenbas. I didn't Shen, you do Dogo, Lua, the Madoba, Lua. Madoba, you the Doyo, I did it, and then Shindik Dundu left you. Doyo Marti Inayang, Korom Yudi, Zimba Nashi, Dana Yudi Yores, or Shindik Dundus, Lord, Dunda Tuba, Koran Zimba Nashi, Yudi Yeva, or Denise, you did la. Koron Yudi Zimba Nashi, Dana Yudi Yova de la, Dundus, Ragula, Iju said, Denisi Lago, also Iju de la, Korom Yudi Naidu. 短期上这有关键，那现在有的真巴钱，有的真巴的几钱，但呢，但真巴来的有的没多把钱，没多把钱，你钱，但有的真巴那些短了，那真巴那短了有的越把钱，我的那些越把那，但落地了，那一去谁的钱。
Teni data kedang döntung ki kola sung sung, kedang lua ki kola sung sung, dang shenik mare, di
shenik döntun se urwade.
Shenik döntun, okay. Ale dang shempa di tampo, rang yula shempa de yang kosa.
Rang yu rang yu zingo re se jikje, rang yu dogo ma re se ni che, rang yu zimba na jo korong yu de ye de se ye ba re se ji, 숨지 기셔 되는 그 숨 차게 된게 똑바텔라 아니 이제라 거래지.
So here we have several key characteristics to this consciousness. It's a factually concordant, determinative knower that is controvertible with regard to determining its object. So let's look at, we're going in the order maybe of the English. So it's factually concordant. Okay, well, let's rather go the Tibetan, it'll be hopefully clearer. So the object appears to the consciousness mixed with a meaning generality. So it's not a direct perception, it's a conceptual consciousness. So the object itself appears to the conceptual consciousness mixed with a meaning generality. And it is apprehended in this way. The object and the meaning generality are used to translate as mental image, but meaning generality is better. So it appears the actual object and the meaning generality appears mixed and is apprehended in this way. So it's apprehended, and this is the meaning of a determinative knower. It's apprehended by this conceptual consciousness. That it is, but it doesn't realize the object. So in Tibetan, the next term will be that it's controvertible. So the object is not realized. So hence it is a non-valid cognizer because it is not incontrovertible but controvertible. So the object is not realized. However, it is factually concordant. So in the Tibetan, that comes third. So it's factually concordant. And this means that the way the object is apprehended is similar to how it exists. So it is factually concordant. So those are some of the key aspects here in the definition: factually concordant, determinative object, and controvertible.
Ranyu le xianba le tokpa chasang gi yu jin yo de tokpa chasang le yu na de duen jin de yu go ne nan go de. Sang duen jin de yu go ne na je yu de jin ba de la ranyu xianba ji go. Da ji sang tokpa chasang ji ba ranyu xianba, ranyu jin go se de xianba ji go. Da di xian la de kim jang ga se ne duen jin na yo de duen jin de yu go ne na je yu de jin ba de la xianba se de de da xian bi de da ru di ru xiao.
What we see here is that it's determining its object. What this means is that it is a conceptual consciousness. The object of all conceptual consciousnesses have a meaning generality mixed with the object. And this is what appears to the conceptual consciousness and is apprehended by it. So determining its object, the meaning behind this is that it's a conceptual consciousness that is apprehending its object, which is mixed with a meaning generality.
Medo to big topa chama jikse, medo jimbi yiju se jikse, sumyorwa. De sumga gi medo jingore, medo sumga le medo nangorwa. Na yidu medo jimbi migi sheba de la medo de na yidu dönjina mata khora sawa saja sebu nangore, dönjina mata wa sawa nangore. Ai sawa nangorwa. Da topa medo topic topa chama de da medo jimbi yiju ni de la medo de na yidu Dönji jidan jeje medo mayimba jik medo da jibu jikya dönji dan je ne na do re. Jisa ko ni sunga ge medo jiba yimba jiba yimba la medo na su de le kya ba ye de.
Let's take then as an illustration to try and make clear here that what is meant. So a flower that one sees. So here a flower is seen with a sense direct perceiver. The very first moment of that sense direct perceiver is a sense direct valid cognizer. This flower is also seen by a mind such as this, a correct assumption. So to all three of these, sense direct perceiver, sense direct valid cognizer, and a correct assumption, the flower itself appears. For the first two, sense direct perceiver, and the very first moment of the sense direct perceiver, which is the sense direct valid cognizer, the flower alone appears. For the third, the correct assumption, which is a conceptual consciousness, whilst also, like the other two, the flower appears, it doesn't appear alone. It appears mixed with, or the flower appears as well as the meaning generality of the flower, and these two are mixed. So with the third type, which is a conceptual consciousness, this correct assumption, it is not free from the presence of a meaning generality. The flower appears mixed with or together with a meaning generality. For the other two types, sense direct perceiver and the sense direct valid cognizer, only the flower appears, not a meaning generality at all. So what these three types of consciousnesses have in common is that to them, the flower appears. Where the difference comes is the direct perceiver directly perceives the flower. The conceptual consciousness perceives the flower but mixed together with a meaning or the flower's meaning generality. So that's where the difference is. When we see a word like determining, so we have here as determinative knower, and then below that, determining its object. This indicates that the consciousness is a conceptual consciousness. It's not a direct perception. A direct perception, such as an eye sense direct perceiver, apprehends a flower. But a conceptual consciousness determines its flower. So these are two different words. That for a direct perception is zinpa. That for the conceptual consciousness is shenpa. So what we should take from this is when we see a word such as determining or determinative knower, it indicates that it's a conceptual consciousness, not a direct perception. And the meaning behind that then is being a conceptual consciousness that has determined its object. That object appears together with a meaning generality of the object. So that is what we should immediately know when we see this word determine. It indicates it's a conceptual consciousness, and therefore the object itself does appear, but it appears together with its a meaning generality.
나 똑바디기 유진바딜라 유신라고 그래. 지금 이 똑바기 유진바다 유신바 지과래. 지 똑바디기 유진바다가라 유신라고 그래. 지금 이 신라 유디 신바 라면도 델리아 안에 유디 진바 잠마인바 가르나오도 깔라 된시다 제네 나와 유바 năng 유바 하고 그러다. 지금 디네자 유디 나와도 된시다 제네 나네 năng 제네 유디 진바인자 델리 신바 스미다고. 그래서 다고 내 매도 지금 똑바디기 매도디 그런 거 진단가 유의하래 先别语来的先有噻，多把的先有噻，然后就开始你嘛，当我语写的语的了，真大语先有真的写嘛，当我写，其实但没多把的个真大语啊的先别语来几把的，可是没多的那就多把那短时间才有可能那钱的没多经过了哇，就是真把一张真大语的钱。就啥的，现那个短时间这个的那的真把一张，俺的先把的是，多把的语的先是的，短时间这个可能语的真把的了，先把先是比当过这边。
Den example kona tok berarti di shenyu tang jintang ki yu de ni metok dang
metok koron jintang yu ya de先比yu ra de先。
metok koron。
metok koron metok真比多把交了哇。metok的真大yu的，可是我metok的真够了哇，真把这yu的真大yu些。但这了先有那个今天开始metok的可多把的那的短时间这个可能那些，俺真把一张。先把的，这个先把的，就是先把这的先有的是，先有的了。
对，但die shenyu的die短期当metok koron。
短期的是
metok
koron先有的些，那对短期的天天当过的，短期的天天那前的metok真把一张，metok的先把的是。这先把一张的，先比喻是了。
Koso, den ngola, ngonsum ki tsemete, de kongi ajintan ki yo, yang metok le. Koso. The meaning of these two words, apprehend and determine, is the same. The object is apprehended. There isn't a difference in meaning in terms of how the mind engages with the object. With the purpose, though, of using different terminology is to indicate, or is to understand that when the word determine is used, that this refers specifically to a conceptual consciousness. And therefore, whilst the object is apprehended, or we'd say determined, it is apprehended, though, together with its meaning generality, mixed with its meaning generality. So that is the purpose of using a different word here. It indicates those two things. It's a conceptual consciousness, and therefore it appears and is apprehended together with its meaning generality. Whereas when we don't see determine, but we see apprehend or grasp, it would be the same word, that would indicate that it's a direct perception and there is no meaning generality. And now just to rewind to when we looked at objects right at the start of the presentation of Lorig. Here, with the direct perceiver, I sense direct perceiver apprehending a flower. The object that it is apprehending is the object of the mode of apprehension, and that is the flower itself. So we have this word here, object of the mode of apprehension, and it's apprehended by a direct perceiver. The flower itself is apprehended by the sense direct perceiver, and it is the object of the mode of apprehension. When it's a conceptual consciousness, the conceptual consciousness has an object of the mode of apprehension, and that will also be the flower. But the flower alone is not apprehended. The flower, being a conceptual consciousness, is apprehended as well as its meaning generality. So therefore, with conceptual consciousnesses alone, we also have a division of object called a determined object. So this word determined again is what we have here, determinative knower or determining its object. So here the object remains the same, it's the flower, but it is But the usage of the term determinative knower makes it clear that it is a conceptual consciousness. And therefore, whilst it is the flower being apprehended, and the flower is the object of the mode of apprehension, the determinative object, it is together being apprehended as well, mixed with its meaning generality.
Daya deji de wangshe na de meto de dunji de mata sawa na ji. Da meto jimbi meto to pe ge to pa chama chi da meto jimbi yi jue se ni yong ru ba. Di ni ga la kun yin la meto na de dunji de je ne na wa yi ba ji ba chi ru ba, ji ba chi. Da kun yin ga de ke ba yo se na.
Jepa ki temes.
Toba topi medo topi jeba tsema jeba inna toba tsema la sheda ji toba tsema ma do jeba ma do so yo ma wa medo topi tsema ji toba tsema ji da medo jimbi yiju ni yo wa kunyi la medo na yi de dunjin de ha de ne na wa ji ba jesa da medo jimba yi ba ji ba le da ga re khe ba yo ro se ne ji di gi medo do go re tsema di gi medo do go re mi lu wa le da yiju di gi medo de jing go re de medo de do yo wa le 이 개발되게 제가 이주디기 매도디 변이 매도의 낭지 된시단 전에 낭 매도 낭의 진퇴시 진바제 매도 진바나시 된라 매도대 여바지 다든이라 찍디기 매도 도고 아래 찍디기 매도 도고 아래 แต่매도 도간 될라 매도도 배체마세 기지당 보이는 체마차 기지 이번에 지시 차이로와 다 되니게 진디 매도 마도한디 될라 이주를 보다 이주
And then konda ngoma kera nangyogi kulasum paibe.
나 대신 나유도 셔로 나유도 된지나 되는 나와 이거 찍어야 시니까
이네 ngonsom yena deni
이 시설과 된지나 맞아 나서 대신 이 시설다 매도 시설다 대니바 칼로스네 매도 또 비게 또 버체마 지당 매도 마도 또 버디 주니 요거레스 코니기 매도 나유도 된지나 되는 나와 이거 찍어야지 코니가 매도 진바 이거 찍어야지 매도 진바나시 된라 매도 이거 찍어야지니까 다 가르쳐봐 열었으네 찍디기 매도 또고 그래서 찍디기 매도 또고 말했어. 但매도 또한 데라 기지 당보 또바이나 제마지 매도도 비 제마. 이니 기지 니바리 있는 매도도 비 지시라. 들어와다 또바 제마도 지시 봐자. 되네게 담아도 한데 매도 진바나지 된라 매도 여바지. 但매도 마도 한 주여와 내려 이주라 거다.
Earlier also spoke or mentioned not only the object of the mode of apprehension and the determined object, you also mentioned the appearing object. So for a direct perceiver, the appearing object is the flower alone. For the conceptual consciousness, such as this correct assumption, the appearing object will be the flower together with its with its meaning generality, and those two appear as one or appear mixed. So he mentioned that earlier, I forgot. And then he also then spoke about the object of the mode of apprehension. And then for the conceptual consciousness, its object of the mode of apprehension is also the flower, but there's also determined object, being the flower. But that term is also used to emphasize it's referring to a conceptual consciousness. Now continuing, so that was from earlier, now continuing. Valid cognizers, as we know, there are two types. There's a direct and an inferential valid cognizer. The direct valid cognizer we've spoken about now, that it directly realizes the flower. An inferential valid cognizer, this does the inferential valid cognizer, to it appears the flower as well as the meaning generality of the flower. Whereas for the direct valid cognizer, only the flower appears. So there's the difference between a direct valid cognizer and an inferential valid cognizer. So then what is the difference then between an inferential valid cognizer and the correct assumption? Because to both of them, the object, the flower, appears together with its meaning generality for both of them, the inferential valid cognizer and the correct assumption. So they both apprehend the flower, the object, in a way that's similar to how it exists, the inferential valid cognizer and the correct assumption, because we see that the correct assumption is factually concordant. So it apprehends the flower in a way in a way similar to how it exists, but despite it appearing mixed with its meaning generality. So both of them are the same in this regard too. So there's two ways the inferential valid cognizer and the correct assumption are the same. The object appears together with its meaning generality, and the object is apprehended in a way that is how it exists. So in those two ways, both of these consciousnesses are the same. How they differ is the inferential valid cognizer realizes its object. Whereas the correct assumption is controvertible. It does not realize its object. So that is the key difference between these two. The correct assumption does not realize its object, although it apprehends it in a way that it exists. The inferential valid cognizer both apprehends it in a way that it exists and realizes it. Then, to represent this definition in perhaps a very clear way, is that to a correct assumption, the object appears together with its meaning generality, and they both are apprehended, but apprehended in a way that the object exists, but the object is not realized. So maybe we can break it down to two key aspects. The object appears together with its meaning generality, and both of them are apprehended in a way that the actual object exists, but that actual object is not realized. Lua says, Ranyu Shemba said Chagore, Lua said Chagorwata, Matova the Luore. That got it Sango Marsene, who Medo Timba Nashin, Donala Medo Yorobesene, Medo Yomare, Donda Gigi Medo, Medone Marwa, quits in the Norderwa. Just I didn't topa the Medo Zingore, the Ina Donla Medo Yorobes, Yomar, Mevaza, Shenji Duntin Marechi, Duntudama, who Medo Zimba, Dondala Medo Yomare, Mevaz di topa the Roche. 로셰 제가 신직 되미tum발에 된tum발라네 신직 된tum발라네 그런 메도 짐바나신 된다라 메도도 예바네 메도디 신직디 되니기 신직디 똑바디 된나 tum바제 다 그런 다들 기기 메도디 메도치 나한테 그 메도 진도바자 나한테 된지나 제네 나와 이바 지바 짐바 이바 짐바 지바 말로 마도 바야 지바래 다 가르친 거 말은 그 짐바나시 되는 메도도 요마래 제가 신직 된주 말, 그 신직 리에 신직 된다 투바데 말에 인자 그 이주 말에 제가 그 로시에 있어거든. These days, plastic flowers really look realistic. I often find it difficult to tell whether a plastic flowers are real or not. So let's take that then as an illustration. So something that is a plastic flower, but if we look at that and think, wow, that flower is so beautiful. So we thinking this is a flower, when actually in reality it is a plastic flower. So let's then apply this definition to that consciousness. So first of all, is this consciousness factually concordant? Well, what has appeared to this consciousness is a flower together with its meaning generality. But the belief is that it is a real flower when it is actually a plastic flower. So therefore, it is not factually concordant. So at the very first point, we see that it is not it cannot be a correct assumption when one sees a plastic flower and thinks it's a real flower. It is a determinative no because it's a conceptual consciousness. It is controvertible in that the object has not been realized. And again, it's determined its object. So it appeared together with the meaning generality. So the other features, apart from the first, the other features of the definition are all complete. But the first is not. It's not factually concordant. So therefore, when one sees a plastic flower but believes it to be a real flower, that is not a correct assumption. In fact, it's a wrong consciousness. It's because the object is factually discordant, or it's understood in a way to be factually discordant. And therefore, it is a wrong consciousness. The first part of the definition, we see a determinative knower. What that means is conceptual consciousness. These two are synonymous. A determinative knower is a conceptual consciousness. A conceptual consciousness is a determinative knower. As we see here, the correct assumption, it apprehends the object in a factually concordant way, so how it exists, but it doesn't realize the object. If it did realize the object, it would be a valid cognizer, either direct or inferential, and followed immediately by a subsequent cognizer. That would be if the object was apprehended in a factually concordant manner, if the object apprehended were in a factually concordant manner and realized, it would be a direct cognizer. If it is apprehended but not realized, so if what is apprehended is factually concordant but is not realized, then it's a correct assumption. So here, between valid cognition and correct assumption, the difference that's being emphasized is not whether the object is apprehended in a way that is factually concordant. That is the same. The difference comes to whether the object is realized or not. If it is, valid cognition, not correct assumption. If the object that is apprehended is apprehended in a way that's factually discordant, then it's a wrong consciousness. Because the object is not apprehended in a way that it exists, and therefore it's a wrong consciousness. If it is apprehended in the way that it exists, but is not realized, correct assumption. If it's apprehended in a way that's factually concordant and realized, valid cognizer.
Da yu di kan de nga de medo ine medo de topa de zin medo ngone peni medo yo ba ji medo de zin je medo de to me na di topa de ju de da de ne ge yu kan de kai ne yu di zin je yu di one yo ba de yu di zin je ane yu di to me ba na di lo de yi ju de da.
if a flower is apprehended, if the object, a flower is apprehended in a way that's factually concordant, but not realized, correct assumption.
이주들이 그 누버 치쇼 망고래. 배나 저기 잘라 마선 길로지 사야라. 가시 길로 시가마도 맨날 길로 시어 말아. 대대 길로지 자자 자담만하네. 자자 뒤주되나 여배네 배네 공마치라 배샤 장에 자담 거로 받아. 자담 거네 배샤 먹지 마도 맨날 공마치 사요 말아. 다들 뒤주되나 여배네 공마치 사요 말아. 굽주고 여번에 고무지 사요 말아. 근데 굽주고 여번에 마사자 때 고무직 차발라 야타마 따다랑 먹고 안디나시 이제들 누바 체션 유도 또야래 타냐냐냐 전에 때문에 굽주고 야자 고무직라 굽주고 나신 파제 또서 되었으면 하면은 이제래고 그 세마 유로지들이 이제 차도 그래. 그래서 내내기 이제들이야 그 누바 체션 루스네 망고리 얘기해.
Hopefully then these key characteristics of a correct assumption and what differentiates a correct assumption from the two types of valid cognition as well as one consciousnesses is hopefully a little clear. Now a further key point to make about correct assumptions in general is they vary a lot in terms of their strength. They vary a lot in terms of their strength. So there's variety in correct assumptions in terms of their strength, because a correct assumption is controvertible. In other words, it doesn't realize its object. So if we say a realization is 100%, then what is approaching 100% is quite a variety, and all of those could be correct assumptions. So you could have a correct assumption at, say, 50% or 80% or 90%. And this shows you have correct assumptions of varying strength.
당어도 이주고 디시지. 다 예와들 이주게다 디와 예와샤도 가르시고를 선되는 마. 다 예와들 나이나 지고. 다 김제 매비 이주에서 직시. 김제 매비 이주. 김제 나가비 이주. 김제 망에비 이주. 김제 마주비 이주. 김제 예장电了 마베비 이주에서 돼. 이주들 나시도 예와 마스나.
And that variety in strength is shown through the 5 divisions. Correct assumptions that do not have a reason, correct assumptions that have a contradictory reason, correct assumptions for which the reason is indefinite, lacks pervasion, or we could say inconclusive. Fourthly, correct assumptions for which the reason is not established, or could be said not proven. And lastly, correct assumptions for which a reason exists but is not completely settled. So these are the 5 divisions, and through them we can come to see that there's quite a difference in the strength of the correct assumption. As we saw in the definition, the correct assumption is a conceptual consciousness. We have this word determinative knows, it's a conceptual consciousness. There is no direct perception that is a correct assumption. Therefore, correct assumptions are only in the continuum of non-Buddhas. Buddhas do not have correct assumptions.
단 김제 maybe 이주에서 대 간에시 시작을 스냅에네 잘미다바 집에 나sam라 때네 잘미다바 집에 로께바 로다고 오셔다 지자 때네 하나 저기 미시기로아 아주 잘미다바 레그로와 나외도 암주데 잘미다바서 지도 거에도 아주려 똑바나네 잘미다바 선배 똑바시키고 그래 지자 디 잘미다바 선배 똑바시키기도 디 잘미다바서 선거래 나디 이주래 김제가 잠미다바 인비그 김제가 해요. 김제가 고요 말에. 진짜 먹고 완전 그 잠미다바 해야지. 되니기 직접나 되네 잠미다바 심비그 똑바디 이주래. 그래서 잠미다바 선반나 달라 잠미다바 요대로 봐. 요래. 이네 잠미다바 또요 말봐. 진짜다. 안지 되니기 삼나디 Jamidaba, Lavadu, Denigi 6 Matene, Tingazuki, Jamidaba, Zimbi, Topachki, Jures, Denigi Jamidaba, Zimbi, Topati, and Ijures, Della Jumse maybe Ijus, Jamidaba, Imbi, Jumsen Gaya, Shiamar, Jumsen Gaya, Goyo Marwa, Mevanzan, did thought Ijil, Jumse maybe Ijil.
Illustration we have of the first, correct assumptions that do not have a reason. An awareness that apprehends sound to be impermanent and dependent upon the mere words, sound is impermanent. So this illustration of this first division is illustrated by when someone tells us something, and independent just on their words, we accept what is said. A key point here is, for this to be a correct assumption, as we know, it has to be factually concordant. So it has to be correct. And that sound is impermanent is correct. But the way that one comes to know this is just on what someone has said. Just based on what someone has said. Their mere words are based on that arises a correct assumption. So here we can see that because sound is impermanent, what has been said to us is factually concordant, that is correct. It's a conceptual consciousness, this understanding that sound is impermanent, and it is the object is not realized. So this is a conceptual consciousness that is controvertible. And it's not realized because someone says sound is impermanent, and you say, okay, sound is impermanent, and you just accept this. But the object has not been realized.
Andina Sina Tiru, Penazzi, Jarosine, Jangamo Re, Laviodu, Namo Jumzen, and Shigoma, Jangamo Re, Lavio, Michigi, Jangamo Re, Laviodu, and the Jangamo Jadi Tonjin, Jingamo Re, and some of Johorvada. In that done a Jangamo Radio, Denigi, Jangamo Re, and some Topati, Jumzen, Jangamo Zingo, the inner Jangamo Imbi, Jumzen, Goyo, Jumzen, some time, Jangamo Zindio. 지난 데니기 이주디 장아모디 또메나 데니기 장아모 준비 똑바디 이주디에서 김제 메비 이주에서 다 장아모레디 진루요레서 장진루요레서 하시는 장아모레 델리아 장진루요레 랍나 땅아모 이비 김제 셰르와 가서 장진루요라로 와 장지 해니 장진루요나 아마 셰르와 지다 장아모레 이나래 장진루요레 나고르디 나모 이비 김제들 가서 장진루요레라로 와 지상 장진루요나 나모 책요로 와 지상 장아모레 델리아 장진루요다 라비오디 안에 장아모 이비 김제 셰사로 와 지상 데니기 셰네 데네 상따제 장아모레 디 장진루요레서 김제 델라 데네 장아모 진비 똑바시키요로 이주시리로 와 델라 김제요 가서네 권 장진루요레 디엔장 아모레 진비 똑바키요로 와 대시 김제 가야마셔제 장아모레 랍샤베나 장아모 진비 똑바시키고 할때 이내 김제 가야 고요 먹어봐서 장아모레 했으면 똑바디 김제 메비 이주에시 다 니베들라 장아모레 디나래 장진망불루요레 라요디 안에 장아모 김제 셰사로와 지선 데네스 디 칙티 고에네 오다디 장진루요 지선 장아모레 했으면 진비 똑바디 김제에 된비 이주 차려래
이니 다른 예처래
다디 이주기 기시고는 아주 이주기 시작
제파기 제만 말해
다들 아주 이주기 기시고는 이주 시작해 마도바 시작 기시고다
There are many illustrations of this. For example, if someone gives you some tea and they say to you, "Oh, this is sweet tea," and you immediately accept that this is tea that is sweet. So this is correct because the person's not deceiving you, it is sweet tea. But the way you come to this factually concordant correct assumption is based only on their words. So therefore, this is an illustration of a correct assumption that does not have a reason. If the person said, "This is sweet tea because I've already added honey," then there is a reason. So that would be an illustration of a correct assumption that is based on a reason.
Tramitawa Rela Mother, Tramitawa Gimzen Kaya Share, Mare, my Shebanza, and did Zimbi Topatele, Gimzen Bibi, she is such. And they see this year. Gimzen Bibi, she didn't. Kawalesta, Nambo the Tramita Jingasaman, Niba, Tramita Chipengade, Tramita, Tamja, some Chiki, Gimzen Kaya Maji, Gimzen Share, Margin. Niba did that. Dunjun, you don't get Tale, Tramita in the law. That is Tramita Hayes, Tramita begins Dunjun Nuber Hayes said, Mishandagi lava in a dada, Tramita Reda, Dunjun Nuber, Dunjun Nubanza, Mitawa in Gure said, Gimzen Mashi by now, and then Tramita in begins Dunjun Nuber said, Gimzen Shea, and then Dushene, Sosuki, Tramita Simbaina, the next somebody. 가서로 김제 예비 시작으로 김제 알레온데 가서 김제 나가요. 유세 망에 유세 나가요 이치서. 된지 누가 말해 세웠다. 미시기 잠이다 말해. 가서 잠이다 자 된지 누가 말해 남나. 된지 누가 동아래 거로 다 된지 누가 말해 남나. 안에 그 잠이다 봐 이미 김제들 가서네 다 된지누가 말해 라고 봐. 제가 네 김생 가와 차로. 그래서 미다와 있나 된지누가 많이 있나? 아니 미다와 많이 비고 많이 먹고 와. 그래서 된지누가 많이 오버 많이 먹고 그래. 오버 많이 미다와 많이 먹고 그래. 제가 네 김생에 가와 차려. 다들 디가선 다 미다와 레라로 와. 이미 김생 가서는 된지누가 말해 와서 된지누가 말해 김생. 제가 김생 꼬야 되다. 다 미다와 임보인데 배 가와 차려. 제가 되네기 Tramitavari, Imbi Gimsa, Tramitaba, that Dunju Tonware, Laviandu, the niggas think the question that Tramitaba Zimbigi, Topati, that Gimson and Kayu is. Carson called Tramitaba Gimsen, the Chevare, the Gimsen Dida, Mitabani, the Doksho Charlie, Kawacha.
Therefore, as we see here, correct assumptions that do not have a reason are, for example, if someone says due sound is impermanent. As we see here in the text, it continues, this is a suitable example because the word sound is impermanent expresses a thesis that sound is impermanent but not a reason. So what has been said is correct, and therefore what is understood is factually concordant, but it's not based on any reasoning. And that's the meaning of the first division. The second division, correct assumptions that have a contradictory reason, are, for example, an awareness that apprehends sound to be, and I'm just going to change the translations very slightly to make it clearer, an awareness that apprehends a sound to be impermanent from the reason of being unable to perform a function. So this is, so what is understood here is that sound is impermanent. This is factually concordant. But the reason that has been given is a contradictory reason, because impermanent and unable to perform a function are contradictory. So therefore, there is contradiction, but sound remains impermanent, even though the reason that is given is contradictory.
장아모 심미제외네 이뉴 돈다 장아모 임바지로와 장아모 임바제 안 장아모 제 야, 디 장아모 인다 니 참망부루에 샤시로다 디 장아모레 니는 참망부루에 라이네 그 장아모 임비 김전데 차루에 라로와 근데 도저 차르와 차루나 장아모 많이 보고로와 제상아모 많이 바차로와 제상 그 나모 임비 김전디 안 차루에 라야디 제상 김전데 가와차 제상 장아모 임비 차로나 나무 많이 고래. 지금 김제 나무 임비 김제 거야 되다. 나무 임바이 도서 가와 차리. 그래서 니네라도 오늘아 장아무 임바제. 야, 다 지금 나무래 장아무야. 장아 디 장아무래다. 니 참망부루에 라바이나. 니네 나 삼로나라 장아무 진비게 똑같이 기고래요. 기고래. 데 이주래. 이내 그 나무 임비 김제 안 참망부루에 세대 차리 장아무 대 임비 김제데 가와 차래. 가와 차래.
To refer to our earlier illustration. If someone gives us a mug of sweet tea, and it is sweet tea, and they say, here's a mug of sweet tea, and they give a reason. This is sweet tea because I added lots of salt. Here, this correct assumption that arises in our mind that this is sweet tea is factually concordant because it is sweet tea. It is a conceptual consciousness. But the reason by which we came to understand that this is sweet tea is contradictory because salt added to tea makes it Tibetan tea, not sweet tea.
Dadi diroshe da dunji nudon resa tanga zuki da yumzena kawi yichiye sa de dise. Da dunji nudon midaba da kawishi. Da yumzen mangye basi ora, yumzen mangye basi ora. Yumzen mangye bi yichiye sa chung ora. Da de garresena trai midaba res. Yimbi yumzasena shasha res ora, shasha res. Jina shasha re la gedu 다 샤샤라는 시샤레 시샤레 예바레라 그러와지다 담미다바레 이미 김선의 샤샤레 람나 아데네게 랍제네 나주기라 담미다바지메 또바키리스 디 담미다바지메 또바디 다 김선 망에비 제레스 그래서는 담미다바레 이미 김선 가레라나 델레 샤샤레스 그러버레다 제 샤샤세데 또의 유대징아도 또의 유제사죠 지난 샤샤 또의 유리나 미다바 인거야 말아 딱바디게 또의 유루와 샤샤레와 그래서 최 담제 동반이 되게 샤샤레 안에 딱바디게 샤샤레 뭐뭐 차상 샤샤레 지난 샤샤 있나 미다바 인거야 말아 지난 그래서 담 미다바레스 임비 김자가 그래서 이 가르레라나 코 샤샤레스라다 지난이 김제 내봐 말해 차왕이 말해서 인고고 말해서 내봐요 말해서 지난 데니기 또 이제 되라 진비 이제 되라 안에 김제 망에 비이지 되라 그래지.
Den kan sunge den har kujo. De rimpa nipa de mala de gyuten normal yore. Gyuten di normal yomare.
차와 여마래.
Yeni kappa yomare.
이제 노트에서 나다 초진 이 판도에는 초진 차와 메디겐지.
네.
망해 봤어요.
What we saw then with the first division, there is no reason. With the second, the reason is contradictory. Now we come to the third, correct assumptions for which the reason is indefinite or it lacks pervasion or inconclusive. So here then the illustration is given, an awareness that apprehends sound to be impermanent from the reason of being an object of comprehension. An object of comprehension is synonymous with object of knowledge. So which means an object of knowledge is something that exists. That's also a synonym. Within existence, or objects of knowledge or objects of comprehension are both impermanent and permanent phenomena. So therefore, sound is an object of knowledge, but that isn't a pervasive reason. Maybe not pervasive, that isn't a clear reason, a definite reason to assert sound as being impermanent, because the reason given, object of comprehension, includes both impermanence and permanent phenomena. So here, it's not that the reason is contradictory or wrong, it's rather that it doesn't actually prove the hypothesis or prove the thesis. So that is the fault with the third type, where the reason given is indefinite or inconclusive.
나데네 나 김제 마주비 이주해야 돼. 김제 마주비 이주들이야. 나 잠이다와 미시게 가서래. 잠이다와래다. 잠이다와래. 이미 가서 미기 시비 통고래 예라래 미시게 송자에 했어. 고 김sen데라. 잠미시 가서래. 자디 미다와래. 김제가래라네 미기 시비 통고래. 미기 시비 송고래 했어. 네 김제 고고래. 제가 미시게 송자 김제 고에서 잠이다와래 두명도 얘네기 김제인데다 김제인데 마주바 차려. 그래서 자고로 미리 시에 통고 말아. 미시 송자고로 말아. 세상 곧 된다 주요 말. 된다고로 말해. 인자디 얘네기 김제권에 잠이다와 집에 준비로디 때 이주에래 이내야 잠이다 봐 이미 김제 거야지 김제 마주 바래서 마주 바래라도 다 그런 미식 숨자 말해서.
Fourthly, correct assumptions for which the reason is not established or not proven. So here the illustration that's given is an awareness that apprehends sound to be impermanent from the reason of being the held object of an I consciousness. So here clearly this reason is incorrect because sound is not established as impermanent because an I consciousness apprehends sound. So clearly the reason is incorrect, or as we have here, not established or not proven. Here the person gives rise to a correct assumption because that sound is impermanent, is factually concordant. This consciousness is a conceptual consciousness, a determinative knower, and the object is not realized once it's controvertible. So therefore, this is still a correct assumption, even if the reason is incorrect.
That is this is a share got a pandora to the she was came in the Dundas came in us and be Genesis.
I feel that perhaps some of you are wondering, what's the point of these 5 divisions? It really seems a bit, yeah.
Dandala Karashigorasina Anzuki Yudi, been the Tamitaba say, Toya, Anzuki, Tango, Toy, Japa Timeto, Mato, Monsum Timeto to go Marwa. Japa Timeto, you got the kind of Japa Tovala, Gumje, sometimes Gumje, Yan Sosuki Gumje sometimes. And Mishandagi Kimsen Didi, Kimsen Go, Mishandagi Kimsen Go, but to Kimsen some Yana or some Taji, 2 to the Kimsen some Taji, you to talk over us. She's not Tamporto, Jebatim Topala di Topores. She's not Jebel Tibet Topala, Dambo, Urim Mason, Yaja Yadam Hawala, Dambo, Yaja Nishu Howard, then Gupju Howard, then Yeju Howard, then Gupju Hamau, then Gupju Guru Howard, then Yatamata Howard, Guru. 지선 체면 또 봐라 계좌 계산 받이 창고거래 디 녀리야 아니 창와라 다 계좌 국주다 계주다 뒤주다 됐으니 디스차산 이주할 이거래 이주할 이거래 지선 되네게 이주 되게 야야야야야야 뭐 공부도 좋지 체면 뭐 교와라 김전 양다 가지고 그랬으마도 되네게 김전 양다 봐 마인바 되네 김전 고바이나 이주 좀 끼기리마도 되 이주 되게 야야야 뭐 공부도 좋고 말해서 지선 체마디 제바 체마 끼투 말해서 지상 되네 김전거나 지디 김전 망해 봐래 지상 데 김전 딜을 때네 이주 좀 끼기리 마도 디 이주리 야 제바 지기 야야 공부도 좋고 말해 지금 다 대시 이주에는 대주 뉴도라서 김전 마두바이나 가와이나 김전 가와 죽고 바이나 안 될래 때네 이주 좀 끼기리 마도 이주리 디 김전 삼내 야네 상담마이나 대리 이주리 야 공부도 좋지 체명오 유튜브 말해서 지상 저기 김제 삼 땅에 또비 제바 체마 개발라 김제 양다 가지고 그래서 김제 양다 가지고 매바네 근데 김제 가와르다 김제 망해 버르다 김제 마주 버르다 김제 매버르자 되네나 또가 이슈섬 기기리 마도 디 야야네 야야야 열교 공부 좋아지 체명어 또 말해서 제가 되네기 김제 거나 제바 체마 기투 말해 돼서 디고 말해서 다 되네 마지 봐서 김전 가르고 와서 김전 양다 가지고 그래서 김전 양다 가지고 해야지 김전 양다 받을 양내 양도 삼나 제바는 되는 체마 제바스마게 두고 그래서 제가 dondarla dishivorta.
It's the reason, the purpose of this presentation, of this detail here, is we're looking in these divisions at the difference, not in that whether this the consciousness that arises is a correct assumption or not. We've looked at the definition. We understand what comprises what are the requirements for a consciousness to be a correct assumption. What we're talking about in these divisions, where the variety comes, is in terms of reasoning. Reasoning is of vital importance in terms of developing realizations. terms of our objects of meditation, eventually we need to develop direct perceptions of what we're meditating on. But before a direct perception can be generated, one has to generate an inferential valid cognizer. Before one develops inferential valid cognizers, one will develop correct assumptions. And the primary difference that will lead to a understanding becoming a realization, in other words, a correct assumption becoming an inferential valid cognition, is the quality of the reason. So you remember the definition, I think, on page 8 of inferential valid cognizers. Here we see a reason, but not any old reason, a correct reason. An inferential valid cognizer arises in dependence on a correct reason. Here we're now talking, back here with correct assumptions, about reasoning a lot. And we see here, a contradictory reason is not a correct reason. No reason is clearly not a correct reason. An indefinite reason or a reason that's not established, all four of these, none of them are correct reasons. Nevertheless, the person has given rise to a mind that is worthwhile, a correct assumption. But when the correct assumption has arisen in dependence on no reason, or that there's a fault in the reason, or the reason is indefinite, it becomes very difficult for that person to develop their understanding into a realization. They require better reasoning to come to the point where that object of meditation is realized. So here, I mentioned earlier, when we started to look at these divisions, that correct assumptions vary greatly in terms of their strength. And hopefully what's becoming clear is that what will lead to a stronger correct assumption is the quality of the reasoning as well as the reflection. So again, to give rise to an inferential valid cognizer, one has to go through a process of reflection based on reasons. The better the quality of the reason, the better the quality of the reflection. And as one continues to reflect or to meditate more and more on good quality reasonings, one will progress towards better quality understandings, eventually giving rise to a realization, a understanding of the topic that is no longer controvertible, but incontrovertible. In other words, where the object is realized. So therefore, the point of looking at all these divisions here is really emphasize this point, that to give rise to realizations, we have to reflect based on reasons, and the quality of those reasons are very important.
이 미시기 순자이나 미다바인 고고로하다 캬와요래 미시 미기 통야지나 미다바마도 따바 미기 통야 말와 그래서 미기 통야이나 통야 미시기 순자이나 미다바인 고고래 이네 잠미다바래 가서 미시기 순자래서 자디 미다바 미시기 순자래요 말이야 지금 주요 말이야 지나 지금 말이지 예서 지나 디 나 저기 미시 순자래 사디 응고래 내가서는 가서 디시기도와 잠시 순자 수유 통과해서 주유 통과해서 제상한테도 막 고바이 착착착 고바이도 잘야 줄이야 암초요 말해서 제상 고변이 고바이도 잘 미리 통하지 않는 거 되고 그랬지 잠시 순자래서 수유 통과해서 안에 주유 미시 통과해서 디시고로 봐 제사 잠시 순자 제사 진짜 잠시 순자 말해라고 말하줄라 잠시 순자 암초 고야래 마도 미기 시비 순자 말해라고 제가 직직다 잠시 순고래 가서는 주유 미시 순고래 가서는 가서 고바기한테 자디 암조 고야요 암조요 말 인자 거 미기 자디 통화진데 그거 뭐 주유 거래서 디시고 진짜 잠시 순자래 라고 이게 다디 라고 김사디 지기 되네 라고래 진라나 디고 말해서 니네수도 하고에 돈달라 디나디 디고
디 drill 기패츠인데 디 규진 망야파 돈저와래 망야파 디 그래서 디 나투미기 셰파데
마루바와 미시 자디 미시 순자 마루와 제 주기 미시 수고 말와다 Sungo 말 미시 순조 코는 말와. 많이 이나다 미카시 가시 요사로 같은 게 자디 미시 순고레스.
Des labés qui devaient
수 순고레 람네 주기 순고레스. 제가 주기 미기 시비게 자 통고레스를 고레스자. 제가 디모네 말레스 자미 자디 미기 시비 통고 말와지.
These divisions then are important to bear in mind because a lot of what we accept is based on hearing it from someone that's in that context. We respect what they have to say and we just readily accept it and we give rise to a correct assumption. But we certainly haven't realized that object. We may think, oh, it's understood, I've heard enough, don't need to hear or read more on that. But whilst we have come to give rise to a correct assumption in relation to that object, because it's factually concordant, conceptual consciousness and so forth, we haven't realized that object. Moreover, if we look at the quality of the reasoning when reasoning is given, this can serve as an impediment to our development because there can be an error in that reasoning. For example, if we take the fourth illustration, correct assumptions which arise for the reason that from which the reason is not established. An awareness that apprehends sound to be impermanent from the reason of being the held object of an eye consciousness. So in the past, people would say, for example, there are beings who can see sound. For example, a snake. Snakes don't have ears, but they can hear someone approach. So therefore, they must be able to see sound. Now that's not correct. So we need to be clear that even if we come to the right conclusion, that there is a reason and the quality of the reason is of great importance.
가시기 신뢰야 세미어레스 지신이 세미어레스 가르스네 예비 김제 가르고 보스네 지신 가실에 니미공ля 니메샤도 세네 로마디 바다제 마 니만마 눕디네 지도는 가르소레 로만마 쿰제 두 쿰디 마 롬차가 자르지가 정도와 안에 야 쇼게야 세대야 니메와 시도 니메 로마디야 치용도와 제가 권 아주 지신라 세미어레스 예비 김제 가라라네 채나고 것도 로마치상 쿰지 예유어레스 지나 남세시야 니메샤도 콘주야 남 니메샤서 거야 랑고어레스 지나 마니에다 라야도와스 지나 디네 자 지신레 세미어레스 지나 지신레 세미어레 예비 김제가진 채나고 로마 쿰지 예유도 와스 김제 디고오레 지나 다 안주기 그 딜라요도 결혼기 지신을 세미비 김전지라 안 디네곰 로모 파쿰지 얘기여 봐지 김전 고고여 봐나 이 김전 망해 봐야지 그래서 이 지신 가시 말로 지신 차상을 쿰지 전하고 마고 님이고야 당세 지신 차상을요 말했어 지신 가시를 마도요 말이죠 결혼 지신 라비 지신을 세미를 지신 상황을 보고 그랬어 지난 지선 사마의 세미어를 지선 로마 쿰니 얘기도 그래도 결혼 김전 거야지 로마 지신 차상라 얘기요 말해 내봐요 말해 당거 말해 지난 결혼 김전 디고도 김전 야다 봐 책 말했으면 니 누스가 와
Moreover, some people assert that fauna has consciousness. And they'll insist that, or it has life, but let's say consciousness, it works better in English. So they say, yes, plants and trees, of course they are alive. We see how petals of a flower open in the morning and close at night. So they have consciousness. They are aware of the time of day. They also need to rest at night. So this is putting aside the fact that plants do not have consciousness. The reason that is given here lacks pervasion. The third illustration lacks pervasion because not all plants, not all flowers open and close in the day and night. So the reason lacks pervasion, let alone the fact that fauna does not have consciousness.
디나라 데니기 지신의 세미비 김전 데네 거야다 아니야 권주게 지신이야 세미비 김전다 데니기 릭망고시야 요서가 두시네 and this chaza that the Samariba and Bene Chera, Consuki, Discussion, Ribana, that this did not do you this was the Shigore.
And this is discussed quite a lot in the texts on the Buddhist texts on valid cognition, where the views of many non-Buddhists, the views of those non-Buddhists who assert that plants have life, are discussed in this way. They, of course, present more than this one reason, but then this is debated in these texts, asserting that plants do not have consciousness.
that jeba seme dohan chigine de stagore manzu ki jeba se dikina ha mohan chile mi chile o da jeba da mita bare da yimbi gyumje gasan da jeba re se gyumje ko jeba ra was 제가 gyumje ya da ba cha de jeba ina mita ba yin ko re gyumje chigdo re ina야 다데 미 랍사 가사 디기 제가 하고 마 제 때나 마 봐봐 그 하고 마 제가 하고 마 한 먹어서 아니 콜 딜라바이네 디 김세진 때미다 또 투에 투고 말 제가 기 투고 말 그래서 그 제가 걸 하고 말아 진짜 한 먹어지가 디레스나 한 먹어 김세들 한 먹어 김세 그거는 이 고통도야 마도 또 투요만 투고 말아 제가 김세 열대 예대 김세 때나 마 봐봐 그래서 그 맨이 랍사 디가 하고 마 제발에서 하고 말 진짜 한 먹어서 디 삼다진 때미다 또 투고 말 진짜 때미다 또 이주 좀 끼리마도 이야 공패도 좋지 재미다고도 제바치는 거 유튜브에요 말해서 제가 김제 지여대 김제 때라 마바바 하셔야 돼. 근데 재미다 말에 이미 김제라서는 다 제발에다 선에 따고 김제 셰바이나 거자 제바 마도한지를 되니기 라바이나 김제 때라 마바바래. 이제 되네 재미다 바지 이주 좀 끼리마도 디 삼단에 야야 공패도 좋지 재미다고도 제바치는 기도 말해지.
Then to look at the fifth division, correct assumptions for which a reason exists but is not completely settled. We see the illustration, an awareness that apprehends sound to be impermanent from the reason of being a product, without it having been ascertained by valid cognition that sound is a product and whatever is a product must be impermanent. So here, the person not only hears that sound is impermanent, but they hear a correct reason, not just any reason, but a correct reason, for the reason of sound being a product. But they don't understand the reason. That is the meaning of not being completely settled. They don't understand the reason. And therefore, without understanding the reason, whilst they come to a correct assumption, that correct assumption, based on a reason that is not understood, cannot be developed into an inferential valid cognizer. So even though an inferential valid cognizer, which arises independence on a correct reason, here we have the correct reason, but it's not understood. So we see that not only do we require correct reasons, but they need to be understood.
제발 좀 이따 봐래. 그래서는 다 제발에다 세김세 제발 김선 거 보이나? 되는 거 가서 다 제발 하고 살아. 제발은 미다 봐 인고에 하고 살아. 되네 인자다. 어다 다 제발 있나? 제발은 미다 봐 인고래. 인자다나. 다시 다디 다 미다 봐 인기에 삼지고 누구는 제발은 야나 삼다도 되네 다 미다 봐 되게 세마디 제발이 겨우 기후고. 진짜 디 김세 거마 김세 걸 따따 차디요. 그래서 그런 게 김제디 진거 제바 또 차례 제바니 미다바 이미 하고 차례 지단 잠미다바 하고요 말에 뭐가 맞다 될라야 잠미다바래 그래서는 다 제바리 김제 고요도 되는 거 김제 삼다데 잠미다바 또 비 이치디 뭐야 고네 오늘 페이지네 잠미다바 또 제바 참아기 두고 그러지래.
Where someone who does understand this reason that whatever is a product is impermanent, they will understand then that sound is impermanent for the reason of being a product. They will understand that this is a correct reason. And then through reflecting on this correct reason which they understand repeatedly, they will quickly give rise to an inferential valid cognizer. Because the reason is correct, they understand that reason, and they engage in repeated reflection, gaining familiarity, and will come to a realization that sound is impermanent. To conclude here then, today we've looked at the first two of the five non-valid cognizers, that of subsequent cognition and correct assumption. And we've looked at them together with the variety of definitions. So to conclude, I think it's important to remind ourselves why we are looking at this. In order to achieve lasting, stable happiness, we have to come to understand ourselves well. We have to come to understand our inner world, our way of thinking. So we have this constant arisal of a variety of consciousnesses. And this just happens in an uncontrolled manner, or in a natural manner. And we need, if we want to take control of our minds and ensure that our minds are directed in only a virtuous direction, we need to understand what is going on in our inner world. So this presentation then on Buddhist psychology, from the very beginning, from objects right up to now to correct assumptions, is all about giving you the tools to understand your inner workings. And in dependence on this knowledge then, to apply it, to give rise to actual realizations, transformative realizations. So for example, in your meditation, you're not likely to meditate explicitly on this topic of Lorig, but through understanding Lorig, you can use that knowledge so as to persevere with more skill in one's meditation. For example, we need to realize the three types of suffering. The suffering of physical mental pain, the suffering of transient pleasure, and all-pervasive suffering. These need to be realized. In order to realize them, merely having an understanding based on a presentation is insufficient. We need correct reasons. Then those correct reasons need to be reflected on repeatedly so that we come to understand them on deeper and deeper and deeper levels. So we'll give rise readily to correct assumptions. But for this non-realization to be transformed into a realization, an inferential valid cognition, that will have a profound impact on us, we need to have knowledge, so correct reasons, and reflect on them repeatedly over a sustained period. That is the unmistaken method to transform our way of thinking. And that is the purpose for looking at this topic here. So there are a few minutes left. If you have some questions, feel free to ask. Andy?
Never been happy with the example of fire and smoke as being an inferential cognition example. It seems to me now that it fits into number 3 of assumptions. Because if you see smoke, then you really, it could be, a smoke machine. But you assume it seems that it's no pervasion.
Okay. I'm not so comfortable with the usual illustration in our modern context of a inferential valid cognition, that independence on seeing smoke, you realize fire. Because if that smoke is actually coming from not fire, but a smoke machine, which is certainly possible, then that would be a correct...
A non-pervasive assumption, a correct assumption.
But it would be a correct assumption of fire? Independence on seeing smoke from a smoke machine?
That's a bit of unconsciousness.
Yeah.
I withdraw the
because it's not factually concordant.
Yeah.
Independence on the question, greater knowledge was gained. Thank you. Peter.
If the present Geshe view is that subsequent cognizers can be valid cognizers, what is the reasoning difference between the present Geshe and the other schools to support it?
So what is the reasoning given by the Prasangika to say that subsequent cognitions are valid cognizers? Okay. Dene tambo andi ki kachide konkatri tangdu dene len lamsang agajum. Dene di loksere notroso sang dene sas. Dene Peter ki kachide di Geshe kola. Dene den gyupalokne Geshe Thubten Rabten, Geshe de konso temere, deni den gyupe rangyupe menche gyuten karilab geres.
Rangyupe gyudi karasne dilar wachna.
Den gyupe rangyupa la karilab geres.
Den gyupe rangyupa la kalagres. Odadi that Hindu big Ranjubala Kalagri Lana, China Hindu big Kalagor Sinem, Kurangi, that capacity dilagore, Kurangi, Sema said, you talk about some Dagara shower, Mado, Dime big that, Pa Doctor Zeshe, Pa DJ, Pa Jabache, Shabaina, Samada, Jeshe, Kabache, Doctor Zeni, Jabache, Shavan, Dinia, my that's what you be. Bendigo却可能大顿真那年没了，却可能不累下巴这么多，可多把大家人了，米路多把大家人吃嘛是下来嘛多，电视机呢，接把这些，地基呢吃嘛下，地基吃嘛都接把这些呢，也要嘛的是，就像就让给吃嘛下这些都是大顿真的下来的，地这个嘛的是，就像地下嘛那大顿真的下的那个，俺那吃嘛的了，俺那个嘞。都现在那原年来嘛的，对当铺多话的，给是当铺多话的，下个礼拜给是200些送吧的，给是当铺的，给是当铺200要了吧的，要了吧，什么给是当铺的，给是当铺200，第二呢，什么给是当铺的，给是200的这些礼拜，俺送吧这些礼拜，当铺什么礼拜，都是这把钱呢，俺那，那个给是当铺的了样，给是当铺700，叫让什么些下次来个买的，叫让大顿真的下个多，的真的挺买的是，但天气不来的地拍些地了过来。그런 게 제시에다 체마셔야지 받제바 제시 따돈 제니 체마셔야기도 체마다 제시 개발 디샤나 지금 말했어. 그래서 따돈 제나 녀요 말했어. 그래서 다 유코로 또 받다가 하는데야 또 받좀들래 밀로 와서 체마 다가라 샤고마다 딜레 파 따돈 제네 근데 잘 지금 말했어. 되는시 견주로 지다 된다는 그래.
사보고서 되는 나서서 가르치기야.
예, 그러다 다시들.
So what I'd imagine prasangikas would say is that you need to investigate further, you need to think about this further, because our point of disagreement is about whether a valid cognizer needs to be new. Our point of disagreement is whether a valid cognizer is only that first moment or not. That's our point of disagreement. And we believe that you haven't investigated or thought about this enough. Do so. And I'd guide your investigation in the following way. Look at when something is realized by valid cognition and think about where is that dividing point between the first moment that you say is a valid cognizer and the second moment that is a subsequent cognizer. Try and find that. Because every moment can be further divided. A moment is not a fixed length. Every moment can be further divided. So I encourage you, think about this further, investigate this further, and try and find this dividing point between that first and second moment. So I'd imagine that's how prasangikas would reply. Okay. Alan?
If we want to progress from a correct assumption to an inferential valid cognition, I mean, is it possible to do that without relying on the tool of like debate that is so pervasive in like, the Tibetan monasteries? Can we do it without engaging in that form of debate, or do we need that rigour of that to develop an inferential valid cognition?
So to develop take our correct assumptions to the point of realization, inferential valid cognition, can this be done without debate?
Yeah.
Then 나도 요 도티기 제도 나도 인지미지 닥쳐 단결에 그러니까 나도 닥쳐 단결에 나도 디제기야 말해. then 나도 유추에 키네 나도 제수 바빠 도쿄에서 얘네 나도 닥쳐 단결에 닥쳐 단계면은 제수 바빠 때문에 도쿄에
따서 세나마스네 제버체로 다스 다데 제버치고 다고 제버체다 미러 라과이 강보 유제 야라 지일네 제버체로 지단 제버체다들라 소소 지구 뒤에제 안에 좀 김전 삼다 야 직디진의 디차우 김전 삼다 제버체다 지식으로 양한테 양 지금 나와 주기 지금 편준 제 최저임의 지제 아니 디디리도와 디진의 디차기로 와세스도 안 결혼 디삼단에 넣을 때 내용을 디진의 디차기를 했으면 되네기 아직 섬수되는 지도 니티 제바체 근데 제바체와 근데 따서다 제바체나 편준 죄들진의 결혼한 디삼단에 디네들 견디네 용도와 디진의 디차기도 와서 김제 삼다 제바치고라 김제 제바체다 따서다나 제바치고라 되네기다 따서마다나 수수라나기 수수라나에서 따사이로 디진은 이 디rel나 아니 디체 차기도와 디는 디차기도 와서 김제 삼다더라 디네 삼다는 거 김제 삼당이 당이지는 는 이주디기 슈체셔가다 안체만으로 통으로 나디와.
So I'd imagine most of you are going through debate, but not in the way that you observe in the Tibetan tradition, or the Tibetan tradition, because there is a particular way of doing it, and it involves a certain way of talking and a certain physical movement, a performance. But what debate is something that I would assume and certainly would hope that many of you do anyway. Because when you do analytical meditation, you are investigating that topic, you're investigating reality. That is what debate is. When you're discussing with your friend, this is my view, what do you think about it? And your friend gives their opinion. This too is analysis, it's investigation. That is what debate is. So the debate in the Tibetan tradition takes a particular form, but the way of achieving the result of debate can and should be achieved in other forms, such as analytical meditation and discussion. Okay.
I cannot do it in a control lab.
And I have one question. Now I've been told I can ask. Did he? 나도 되게 처음 좀 이따 인사하고 그래. 얘는 가서 내 사람은 나도 톡 가서 Kansi ngaso di tokna.
Kira diyo di khonsa lab tabo.
Ne keran tam. Kansi ngaso di tokna. Deni shempe ngaso duksa labna. Ngaso lungnangi mare. Kansi mitapade karezini lungnangi mare. Ngaso di taksin giyare. Jecha di ngaso yicho yare. Yicho yewa dambo yare.
Le yicho yare mato ngaso doyo ma. Dame taba doyo ma. Ngaso dame taba re sami yicho yare.
Okay. So I'll give the question and answer together. So I ask Genla, we all sitting here, I imagine, accept that sound is impermanent. It's not very complicated, but my presumption is none of us, I certainly don't have an inferential valid cognition of sound being impermanent, even something as simple as that, because if that were the case, I would have realized sound being impermanent. And that would mean when hearing something unpleasant, I would be undisturbed by it because I'd know this is just it's impermanent. It's arisen in dependence on causes and conditions. It passes in a moment. But as that, I do not have that reaction. I could not have realized even that sound is impermanent. And therefore, would it be correct to say that I have a correct assumption that is not based on a reason? And Genla agreed with that probably none of us have realized that sound is impermanent yet, but we probably all do have a correct assumption that is not based on a reason in relation to impermanent sound. Okay.
Yes, indeed.
Just sorry, can I reinstigate my question? No, so if you see smoke in the forest and you know fire, surely, yes, it is an assumption based on the reason that where there's smoke, there's fire. But actually, it's a non-pervasive reason. So surely it is still an assumption.
Okay. So if you see smoke in a fire, and if you see smoke in a forest and you realize that there's fire, this is a correct assumption, not inferential valid cognition, because the reason is non-pervasive, and the reason. And why is that reason they're non-pervasive?
Because smoke machine.
It could be a smoke machine. Okay. Then come. Natsu shina sa. Tempo natsu dua tongiore. Then de dua de. Then me yore. Yine me samna de gyutsen de makiapde. Kadensa. Ja, makiap di sumpa.
Mange bares.
Ja, di sumpa de.
De gyutsen mange bares.
Mange pare. Mange pare. Karensena chulche rikchik duwa sögyore. Jetang me yore, yini duwa yore, me yore, then yini darun yichore, kanse di gyutsen yangdakpa mare, kanse me de, chi duwa de, chi jena chulche ne lepsa. Wenn die shaking consort giduna dua yades, then die chulchene yongia.
Za didi roa ngazala sa dua dena de la rik mirama go resiza namru dua tenje tor so na dua maro so dua de dua. Sesa de me yo dua dula me kya ya mare. Sesa dua dena shinna ma dua dena de ya chik shur so de ha chik da ko dua dena me yene dua dena mixi chik da di da de keba chu de me dang cha che ane me de so sha na dua de ya ga le de che ro ba di dua yo ba zam ji me yo ba tu go ba da me yo bi ge dua de ya mixi tu go ba keba de na de sta san ka chu ba ji ne di ro da 미신이 매서는 미신이 두어서요. 미신들 나로 매요. 당한 좀 me 마고 그거 매나 차와 줘요.
초치 남자가 콘소 제규 최제당. 근데 제규 최제당내 두어 연결.
제규들 줘요 말이야.
네, 줘요 말이야.
근데 두어 이미
그러니까 아주 두어 민타기래 돼 말로.
디 두어 이미 타기래. 두어 말해라면 지금 그냥 또 랑바도 두어도 랑바래라면 두어 내가 말이야.
I would question then that what is called smoke that arises from what is called the smoke machine, whether that is smoke or not. And then one can have a discussion then based on whatever conclusion one comes to. Because we see things that we may call smoke or we may call a cloud or whatever. For example, the trail that an airplane leaves. So if we don't know that there's a plane, we just see this, I forget what it's called, it's trail? Chemtrail. Then we think, oh, look at the wisp of cloud, but it's not. But if we were to call it that cloud, as maybe did as kids, then we can call it clouds. So I'd think maybe that the smoke that comes from a smoke machine is really only called smoke, but is not actually smoke, and that it's produced in such a different way.
It's a smoke machine.
Yes, exactly. It has to be. It has to be.
세상에 있습니다. 맥버에서 들리가오로 두어도 보러 더우로 소다다 지금 가보마도 치중 되어서 개발마다 세상 니 통화진 어디 보러 해서 지금 보러 나보래를 따다 참는다디 쇼과를 가보도 쓰면 되네야지 추시에 연구와.
So perhaps similarly, when I was in India, all the crows I'd ever seen were black. But I heard from my friends, no, not all crows are black. There are white crows. Where are they? I've never seen one. Oh, foreign countries have white crows. Now I come here, I see a magpie. To me, it looks like a crow. Maybe this is a white crow. And we just call it a magpie, but maybe it's a white crow. Well, thank you very much.